The plate shattered against the kitchen floor before Evelyn even realized her hand had let go of it. "He is here," her mother said, standing frozen in the doorway with her apron still tied around her waist. "Evelyn, the Duke is here, 20 minutes early. 20 minutes and the table is not even set." Evelyn dropped to her knees and began gathering the broken pieces, her fingers moving fast, her mind moving faster. She had known this dinner would matter. She had not known it would matter this much, this soon, with a stranger's expensive shoes already crossing her family's front porch. "Leave it," her mother said. "Leave the plate. Go and open the door before your father does something foolish." Evelyn stood, wiped her hands on a towel, and walked toward the front hall with her heart hammering somewhere near her throat. She had pictured this evening 100 different ways over the past week. In none of those pictures had she imagined opening the door herself, breathless, with a small cut on her palm from a broken plate. She opened the door anyway. The man standing on the porch was tall, dressed in a dark coat that looked like it cost more than her father's car, and he was studying his watch with an expression of open irritation. "You are early," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. He looked up. His eyes were pale gray, sharp, and completely unbothered by her tone. "I am precisely on time. Your family, it seems, is running behind." "We were told 7 o'clock. "It is 7 o'clock. Evelyn glanced past him toward the street, where a black car waited with its engine still running, as if he might change his mind and leave at any moment. Somewhere behind her, she could hear her mother's rushed footsteps and the clatter of a serving dish being moved too quickly across the counter. "You could have waited in the car," she said. "I do not enjoy waiting," he said simply, and stepped past her into the house without being invited. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment, stunned by the sheer nerve of it, before she shut the door and followed him inside. This was Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Wren Hollow, the man whose signature could save her father's company or destroy it completely, and he had just walked into her home like he already owned it. Her father appeared from the study, adjusting his tie with visibly shaking hands. "Your Grace," he said, extending a hand, "we are so pleased you could join us this evening." "Are you?" Julian said, glancing around the front hall with an expression that suggested he was cataloging every imperfection he could find. His eyes moved over the slightly crooked painting on the wall, the stack of unopened mail on the side table, the smell of something slightly overcooked drifting from the kitchen. "Your home is smaller than I expected." The room went very quiet. Evelyn's father laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they do not know what else to do. "Well, we are not aristocracy, Your Grace, just a working family trying to keep the lights on." "Evidently," Julian said. Evelyn felt something hot rise in her chest. She had spent all afternoon polishing silverware that did not match, arranging flowers that were not quite fresh enough, trying to make a home that had never needed to impress anyone look like it belonged in the same conversation as a duke's estate. And this man, standing in her front hall in his expensive coat, had reduced all of it to a single insult before he had even taken off his shoes. "If you find our home so unimpressive," Evelyn said, "you are welcome to wait in your car until dinner is ready." Her mother made a small strangled sound from the kitchen doorway. Her father's face went pale. Julian turned to look at her properly for the first time, and something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but close to both. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. "I am the person who opened the door for you," Evelyn said, which, apparently, was a mistake. "Evelyn," her father said sharply, "please." "No," Julian said, holding up a hand without looking away from her. "Let her speak. I find it refreshing." "I doubt that," Evelyn said. "Men like you rarely find honesty refreshing. You find it inconvenient." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. Evelyn's mother had gone completely still, a serving spoon frozen halfway between the pot and the table. Her father looked like he was calculating how many different ways this evening could go wrong and finding the number far too high. Julian, for his part, simply studied her, his head tilted slightly, as though she were a puzzle he had not expected to find in this particular house. "Men like me," he repeated. "And what exactly do you know about men like me?" "I know you arrived early to catch us unprepared," Evelyn said. "I know you insulted our home within 30 seconds of walking through the door, and I know you are used to people apologizing to you instead of the other way around. That is a great deal of confidence for someone who has known me for less than a minute." It did not take long to form an opinion. Something flickered across his face, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might turn around and walk straight back out the door, taking her father's business deal with him. Instead, he removed his coat, folded it over his arm, and said, "Then let us see if that opinion survives dinner." Dinner did not go smoothly. It went, in fact, about as badly as Evelyn's mother had feared, though not in the way anyone expected. The soup course passed in tense small talk, with her father attempting to steer the conversation toward business figures, and Julian answering every question with the fewest possible words. Evelyn sat across the table, watching him dissect her family's carefully rehearsed politeness the way a surgeon dissects a body, precise and detached, and she found herself growing angrier with every course that arrived. It was the second course, a roast that had turned out slightly dry despite her mother's best efforts, that finally broke the fragile peace. "This is overcooked," Julian said, setting down his fork. "It is homemade," Evelyn said. "Not everyone has a private chef, Your Grace." "That is not an excuse for poor technique." "It is not a technical failure. It is dinner, in a home, made by a person who has been cooking since 6 o'clock this morning while also trying to make a house look presentable enough for a man who apparently cannot tolerate imperfection." "Evelyn," her mother whispered. "No," Evelyn said, feeling something in her chest crack open. "I want to know why he thinks it is acceptable to walk into someone's home and criticize everything he sees. The house, the dinner, us." Julian set down his napkin with a deliberate slowness that somehow felt louder than shouting. "You mistake honesty for cruelty." "I do not think I am mistaken at all." "Then let me clarify. I did not say your home was unworthy. I said it was smaller than I expected. That is an observation, not an insult. I did not say the roast was inedible. I said it was overcooked. Also an observation. You are the one attaching cruelty to my words. That is your interpretation, not my intention. Intentions do not matter if the effect is the same. They matter a great deal, actually. A man who insults you on purpose and a man who states a fact you dislike are not the same creature, even if the sentence sounds identical. That is a very convenient philosophy for someone who has never had to consider how his words land on people with less power than him. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time all evening, Evelyn saw something other than boredom or irritation cross his face. It looked almost like interest. "You assume a great deal about what I have and have not had to consider," he said. "Then correct me." "I do not owe you an explanation." "No," Evelyn agreed. "You do not. But you walked into my home expecting deference, and instead you got an argument. If that displeases you, the door is exactly where you left it." Her father made a strangled sound, somewhere between a cough and a plea for mercy, but Julian did not look away from Evelyn. The rest of the table seemed to fade into the background, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of the evening, all of it dimming beneath the sharp focus of two people refusing to back down. "You are either very brave," Julian said slowly, "or very foolish. Perhaps I am simply tired of pretending that wealth excuses bad manners." A long pause followed. Evelyn's mother had abandoned all pretense of eating and was staring between the two of them with the wide, alarmed eyes of someone watching a car accident she was powerless to stop. Her father had his face buried partially in his hand. as though physically trying to hold the evening together. Then unexpectedly, Julian laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, as if it had escaped him before he could stop it. "I have not been spoken to like that in a very long time," he said. "I imagine people are usually too afraid," Evelyn said. "They are. Most people spend our entire acquaintance agreeing with everything I say, hoping I will notice them favorably. It is exhausting." "Then you should try surrounding yourself with people who do not need anything from you." An interesting suggestion, coming from the daughter of a man who very much needs something from me tonight. The words landed like a slap, and Evelyn felt her face grow hot, not from embarrassment but from anger. Before she could respond, her father spoke, his voice tight and pleading. "Your Grace, please, my daughter did not mean—" "She meant every word," Julian interrupted, still watching Evelyn. "And she is right to point out the imbalance in this room. I hold considerable power over your family's future tonight, and everyone at this table knows it except, apparently, her, who seems entirely unwilling to let that fact silence her." "Someone should say the things everyone else is too frightened to say," Evelyn said quietly. "Yes," Julian said, "someone should." The rest of dinner passed in an uneasy but strangely charged atmosphere. The arguments did not stop entirely, though they softened, shifting from insults about the house and the food into something closer to genuine debate, about class, about the difference between honesty and cruelty, about whether kindness was a luxury reserved for people who could afford it or a duty owed regardless of circumstance. Evelyn found herself, despite everything, drawn into the conversation in a way she had not expected. Julian argued the way a fencer fought, quick, precise, never wasting a movement, and though she disagreed with nearly everything he said about privilege and responsibility, she could not deny that he listened to her responses with more attention than most people gave her in an entire conversation. Somewhere between the second course and the third, the conversation turned, unexpectedly, toward Evelyn's own ambitions, a subject she rarely discussed with strangers, let alone strangers who had spent the evening insulting her family's dinnerware. "What is it you do, exactly," Julian asked, "when you are not defending your mother's cooking with the ferocity of a small army?" "I work with my father mostly. Bookkeeping, correspondence, the parts of running a company that no one else wants to handle." "That sounds like a waste of whatever education you received." "It is not a waste, it is necessary." "Necessary and fulfilling are not the same word," Julian said. "I did not ask if the work was needed. I asked if it satisfied you." Evelyn opened her mouth to give the same practiced answer she gave everyone who asked, that she was happy to help her family, that the work mattered, that she had no complaints. Instead, faced with his unflinching directness, something more honest slipped out before she could stop it. "No," she admitted, "it does not particularly satisfy me, but it is what is needed right now, and wanting more than what is needed feels, most days, like an indulgence I cannot afford." Julian studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, the sharp condescension of earlier giving way to something that looked almost like respect. "That is a very practical way to live," he said. "I am not certain it is a very happy one." "Not everyone has the luxury of choosing happiness over practicality, Your Grace." "No," he agreed quietly, "I suppose they do not." It was the closest thing to common ground they had found all evening, and neither of them seemed quite prepared for it, the conversation settling into an unfamiliar, careful quiet before her mother broke the silence by asking if anyone wanted more wine. By the time dessert arrived, a simple fruit tart that her mother had made with visibly trembling hands, the tone at the table had shifted from disaster to something far stranger. Her father, who had spent the first half of the evening looking like a man watching his life's work collapse, now watched the exchange between Julian and Evelyn with a look of cautious, confused hope, as though he could not quite believe the argument had not ended everything. When the meal finally ended, Julian stood, thanked Evelyn's mother for the meal with what almost sounded like sincerity, and shook her father's hand. "We will discuss the terms of the agreement on Thursday," he said. "My office will send the details." "Thank you, Your Grace," her father said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank you truly." Julian nodded, then turned toward Evelyn, who stood near the doorway with her arms crossed, watching him with an expression she could not quite name herself. "You were rude to me tonight," he said. "You were rude first." "That is true." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened just slightly, just enough for her to notice. "I do not often meet people willing to argue with me. It is a rare quality. I imagine most people are too worried about losing something. And you are not." "I have very little to lose tonight that is actually mine," Evelyn said. "This dinner was never about me." "Perhaps it should have been." Before she could respond, he was already moving toward the door, coat over his arm, leaving the sentence hanging in the air behind him like smoke. He did not say goodbye to her parents again. He did not thank them a second time. He simply walked out into the night, climbed into the waiting car, and disappeared down the street. The moment the front door clicked shut, her mother sank into a chair at the kitchen table as though her legs could no longer hold her. "I have never been so frightened in my entire life," she said. "Evelyn, you argued with a duke about a roast." "He deserved it." "He may have deserved it," her father said, dropping into the chair across from his wife. His voice caught somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. "But he also holds the future of this company in his hands, and you spent an entire dinner telling him exactly what you thought of his manners. Would you have preferred I said nothing while he insulted our home?" Her father rubbed his temples, saying nothing for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, a tired laugh escaped him. "No," he admitted. "I do not suppose I would have, though I nearly had a heart attack watching it happen." "Did you see his face?" her mother said slowly, turning the memory over as though examining it for the first time. "When she told him he was welcome to wait in his car, I thought he might actually leave. And then he simply took off his coat and stayed." "He stayed through dessert," her father said, something thoughtful entering his voice. "I have heard stories about that man. People who work with him say he rarely stays anywhere longer than strictly necessary." Evelyn said nothing, gathering the last of the dessert plates from the table, though she had heard every word and found herself, despite her exhaustion, replaying the evening in her mind long after her parents had finally gone up to bed. Evelyn stood in the doorway long after the car had vanished, staring at the empty street, replaying every sharp word they had exchanged across that table. She told herself she was angry. She told herself the evening had been humiliating, that his arrogance had nearly cost her father everything, that she should feel nothing but relief that it was over. But as she closed the door and turned back toward the kitchen, where her mother was already gathering plates with shaking hands, Evelyn realized that what she actually felt was something far more complicated than anger. She felt, against every instinct she possessed, curious. 2 days later, a car arrived outside the Marsh family home, sleek and black and entirely too polished for their quiet street. Evelyn watched from the window as a driver stepped out and approached the door, holding an envelope with the Ashcombe family crest embossed across the front. "It is for you," her father said, staring at the envelope with a mixture of confusion and concern after the driver had gone. "Not for me, for you." Evelyn took the envelope with hands that were steadier than she expected, considering how quickly her heart had begun to race the moment she saw the crest. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, the handwriting sharp and slanted, unmistakably written by someone accustomed to giving instructions rather than requests. "You will act as liaison between your father's company and my office for the duration of this agreement. My assistant will send further details. Do try to arrive on time." There was no signature, only the initial J, but Evelyn did not need one. She could hear his voice in every line, dry and commanding, and entirely too pleased with itself. "What does it say?" her mother asked. Evelyn folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, her mind already racing ahead to Thursday, to the office she had never visited, to the man who had turned one disastrous dinner into something neither of them seemed able to walk away from. "It says," Evelyn said, "that this is not over." Her father sat down heavily at the kitchen table, rubbing a hand across his face. "I do not understand him," he admitted. "One moment he seems ready to walk away from the entire arrangement, and the next he is sending private letters to my daughter as though nothing happened." "He is a strange man," Evelyn agreed. "Strange is one word for it," her mother said, setting a cup of tea in front of her husband. "Difficult is another. I have never in my life watched two people argue over a roast the way you two argued over that roast." "He deserved it," Evelyn said. "He was insufferable." "He was," her mother agreed. "Though I noticed he did not leave. Most men in his position would have simply excused themselves and let their assistant handle the rest of the arrangement by telephone. He stayed for the entire dinner. He stayed through dessert." Evelyn had noticed that too, though she had spent the last 2 days trying not to think about what it might mean. She told herself it meant nothing, that men like Julian Ashcombe did not abandon business deals over minor social discomfort, that his continued presence at the table had been a matter of pride rather than curiosity. She told herself this several times, and found, each time, that she believed it a little less. That night, unable to sleep, she took the letter out again and read it a second time, then a third, searching the sparse handwriting for something she could not quite name. There was nothing sentimental in it, nothing that suggested warmth or apology, and yet the fact that he had written to her directly, rather than instructing his assistant to contact her father, felt significant in a way she could not fully explain. She thought about the way his expression had shifted at the dinner table, the flicker of surprise when she had refused to back down, the reluctant respect that had crept into his voice by the time dessert arrived. She thought about the sharp, unfamiliar thrill of arguing with someone who did not simply agree with her out of politeness, who pushed back, who seemed to actually listen to what she said even while disagreeing with it. It was an uncomfortable realization, sitting there in the quiet of her bedroom with the letter in her hands, that she was looking forward to Thursday. She told no one this, not her mother, who would have asked far too many questions, not her father, who was already anxious enough about the fate of his company without wondering whether his daughter had developed a complicated fascination with the man who held its future in his hands. Thursday arrived faster than she expected, and slower than she wanted, depending on the hour. By the time she stood outside the glass tower that housed the Ashcombe offices, smoothing the front of her blouse with hands that would not quite stay still, she had rehearsed a dozen different versions of how their next conversation might unfold. None of her rehearsals prepared her for what actually happened. She was right that it was not over. She simply had no idea, standing there on the sidewalk with the letter folded carefully in her bag, exactly how far from over it truly was. The Ashcombe office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass building in the center of the city, and Evelyn had never felt more out of place walking into a room in her entire life. Every surface gleamed. Every person moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that made her aware of the wrinkle in her blouse and the scuff on her shoe. A young assistant named Charlotte met her at the elevator, offered a polite but distracted smile, and led her through a maze of hallways toward a corner office with frosted glass doors. "He is expecting you," Charlotte said, "though I should warn you he is in a mood today." "Is he ever not in a mood?" Charlotte's smile flickered, caught between amusement and discretion. "Rarely," she admitted, before knocking once and pushing the door open. As they walked, Charlotte glanced sideways at Evelyn with poorly concealed curiosity. "You are the one from the dinner," she said, "the one who argued with him about the roast." News travels quickly here. He does not usually mention personal dinners at all, let alone describe them in detail to his staff, Charlotte said. You made quite an impression. I am not certain impression is the right word for it. He used the word formidable, Charlotte said, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret, which from him is practically poetry. Evelyn did not know what to say to that, and was still turning the word over in her mind, formidable, when Charlotte knocked and pushed open the frosted glass door. Julian sat behind a wide desk covered in papers, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a pen moving quickly across a document without looking up. You are 3 minutes late, he said. Traffic, Evelyn said, stepping inside. Traffic is not an excuse. It is a predictable variable that competent people account for. Good morning to you too, Your Grace. He looked up then, and something in his expression shifted, quick and almost imperceptible, before settling back into cool professionalism. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. We have a great deal to review. What followed was 2 hours of dense financial documents, contract clauses, and terms that Evelyn had never encountered before in her life. She had expected, given the tone of their first meeting, that Julian would spend the session finding new ways to insult her intelligence. Instead, he explained everything with a patience that surprised her, breaking down complicated language into terms she could understand, correcting her when she misread a clause, but never once making her feel foolish for asking. Your father's numbers do not add up, Julian said partway through the meeting, tapping a page with the end of his pen. This projection assumes growth that is simply not realistic given current market conditions. He has been under a great deal of pressure, Evelyn said. He is not trying to deceive anyone. I did not say he was. I said the numbers are wrong. There is a difference between dishonesty and poor arithmetic, though the result can be equally damaging. And what do you suggest? I suggest you learn to read a balance sheet before you argue with me about one. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, but this time it was not entirely from anger. There was something in the way he spoke, direct and unbothered by softening his words, that felt less like an attack and more like a challenge. She found herself leaning forward instead of pulling back. Then teach me, she said. Julian paused, pen hovering over the page, and studied her for a long moment. You want me to teach you accounting? I want to understand what my father's future depends on. If that requires learning accounting from an arrogant duke, then yes. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing just as quickly. Very well, he said. Pay attention. I do not repeat myself. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a fixture of Evelyn's schedule, twice, sometimes 3 times a week, always in that same corner office with its gleaming surfaces and its impatient owner. She learned to read financial statements the way other people learned languages, slowly at first, then with growing confidence, until she could catch errors in projections before Julian pointed them out himself. He noticed, of course he noticed, he seemed to notice everything. You are improving, he said one afternoon, sliding a report across the desk toward her. Find the discrepancy. Evelyn scanned the numbers, her eyes moving quickly down the columns until she found it, a small inconsistency buried in the third quarter projections. Here, she said, tapping the page. This figure does not match the previous report. Julian leaned forward, studied where she had pointed, and nodded once. Correct. You seem disappointed. I am not disappointed. I am reconsidering my assumption that you would need several more weeks to catch that particular error. Is that your version of a compliment? It is the only version you are going to get. Evelyn laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her before she could stop it, and Julian's eyes flickered toward her with an expression she could not quite name, something between curiosity and something warmer, something he seemed to catch himself feeling and immediately suppress. She began noticing small things about him that contradicted the arrogant, dismissive man she had met at her family's dinner table. He remembered, without being told, that she took her coffee black in the afternoons and sweet in the mornings, and had it delivered to her exactly that way without comment. He canceled meetings that ran long rather than let her miss her train home, though he never explained why. Once, when a vendor on the phone had been particularly difficult with her, she had turned to find Julian standing in the doorway of the meeting room, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression, his jaw tight in a way she had never seen before. "You did not need to listen to that," she said after she had hung up. "I was not eavesdropping. I was ensuring you were not being spoken to inappropriately. I can handle a difficult phone call, Your Grace." "I am aware," he said. "That does not mean I enjoyed listening to it." It was a small admission, barely a sentence, but it lodged itself somewhere in Evelyn's chest and refused to leave. She found herself thinking about it that evening and the evening after, turning the words over like a stone in her pocket, trying to understand what exactly they meant. The turning point, the moment Evelyn later understood as the true beginning of everything, came on an ordinary Tuesday, when their meeting ran later than usual, and the office around them had gone quiet and dark, most of the staff having gone home hours earlier. "You do not have to stay," Julian said, without looking up from the contract in front of him. "It is late." "You are still working." "I often work late. It is not your obligation to match my hours." "I do not mind," Evelyn said, and meant it. There was something oddly peaceful about the quiet office at that hour, the two of them working in comfortable silence, the city lights glowing faintly through the windows. Julian glanced up, studying her with an expression she had learned over the weeks to recognize as thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Your family's dinners," he said suddenly, "are they always so loud?" The question caught her off guard. "Usually louder," she admitted. "My mother invites too many people and cooks too much food, and everyone argues about something ridiculous by dessert. It is chaos." "It sounded like it," he said, and there was something in his voice, something quieter, something almost wistful, that made Evelyn set down her pen and look at him properly. "Did your family not have dinners like that?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Evelyn began to wonder if she had asked something she should not have. "My father believed dinner was a formal occasion," he said finally. "Structured, silent, a place to demonstrate discipline, not affection. I do not recall a single meal in that house that resembled anything close to what I witnessed at your family's table." "That sounds lonely." "It was efficient," he said, though the word sounded hollow even as he spoke it. Evelyn wanted to ask more, wanted to push past the careful walls he had built around himself, but something in his expression told her the door had already begun closing again, the vulnerability retreating behind familiar composure. "For what it is worth," she said instead, "you are welcome to sit through the chaos again sometime. It is not so bad once you get used to it." Julian looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his pale gray eyes. "Perhaps I will," he said quietly, and then, as if catching himself revealing too much, returned his attention to the contract in front of him. Evelyn did not push further, but she noticed over the following days that he no longer left their meetings the moment the clock struck the hour. He noticed, too, though neither of them said it aloud, that something between them had shifted quietly, without either of them fully agreeing to it. There was a Friday, near the end of that stretch of quiet weeks, when Julian invited her to a dinner that was not a business meeting at all, though neither of them called it anything else out loud. It was held at a small restaurant tucked behind a row of shops, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a menu written on a chalkboard, entirely unlike anywhere Evelyn expected a duke to choose. "This is not what I imagined," she admitted, glancing around at the low light and the worn wooden tables. "You imagined something with too much silver and not enough flavor," Julian said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I imagined something that matched the rest of your life. This is closer to the life I would choose if I were permitted to choose it freely," he he said, and there was something almost unguarded in the way he said it, a rare crack in the composed exterior he wore everywhere else. They talked that evening about things that had nothing to do with contracts or projections. He told her, hesitantly, about a summer he had spent as a boy at a small cottage his grandmother owned by the coast, the only stretch of his childhood he remembered without a trace of tension in it. She told him about her own childhood, chaotic and loud, filled with cousins and neighbors who treated her family's small house as an extension of their own. "You speak of it fondly," Julian said, "the chaos. It is the only version of family I have ever known. I did not realize until I met you that some people grow up wishing for exactly the opposite." "I did not realize it either," Julian admitted, "until I sat at your table and watched what it looked like when a family argued about something as small as whether the potatoes needed more salt, and then laughed about it 30 seconds later as though nothing had happened at all." Evelyn smiled, turning her water glass slowly between her fingers. "You could have that too, you know, if you wanted it." "I am beginning to think I do want it," Julian said quietly, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, the noise of the small restaurant filling the silence between them in a way that felt, for the first time since they had met, entirely comfortable. It was one of the last easy evenings they would have for a while. Because it was that same week, while reviewing the archived records ahead of a routine audit, that Evelyn stumbled onto the discrepancy that would unravel everything they had carefully built between them, and force both of them to confront a history neither had been ready to face. It would take one more argument, sharper and more painful than the first, to force both of them to admit exactly what that shift had become. The crisis arrived without warning, the way most crises do, disguised as an ordinary Monday morning that quickly turned into anything but. Evelyn arrived at the office to find Charlotte packing near the elevator, her usual composure cracked open by something close to panic. "One of our largest partners is threatening to withdraw from the agreement," Charlotte said, before Evelyn had even removed her coat. "There are inconsistencies in the paperwork. He wants everything reviewed and resolved within 48 hours or the entire deal collapses." 48 hours? He is already in his office. He has been there since 5 o'clock this morning. Evelyn found Julian exactly where Charlotte said he would be, surrounded by stacks of documents, his tie loosened, his usual composure worn thin at the edges. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief moment, something in his eyes softened before the pressure of the situation reasserted itself. "We have very little time," he said. "I need you to review every transaction from your father's company over the past 2 years. If there is an error, we need to find it before our partner does." They worked through the day without pause, the office around them filling and emptying with staff who came and went in shifts, while Julian and Evelyn remained fixed at the same table, poring over documents until the numbers blurred together. Around midday, Charlotte arrived with sandwiches neither of them had requested, setting them down without comment before disappearing again, clearly under instructions not to let either of them forget to eat. Julian barely glanced at his, too absorbed in a spreadsheet, until Evelyn finally pushed it closer to him. "You will not solve anything if you collapse from hunger," she said. "I have gone longer than this without eating." "That is not the achievement you seem to think it is." He looked up at her then, something almost fond crossing his face despite the tension of the day. "You sound like my grandmother." "I will take that as a compliment, since I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting her." "You would like her," Julian said, finally picking up half the sandwich. "She would like you considerably more. She has been asking about you since the night of the dinner. In a manner I would describe as relentless." "What have you told her?" "That you are difficult, opinionated, and entirely unafraid of me," Julian said, "which, in my grandmother's estimation, makes you the most interesting person I have mentioned to her in years." Evelyn laughed despite the exhaustion pressing at the edges of the day, and for a brief moment, The crisis surrounding them faded into the background, replaced by something lighter, something that felt, despite everything, remarkably like the beginning of a friendship neither of them had planned on. By evening, the office had emptied entirely, leaving the two of them alone in the glow of desk lamps, exhaustion pressing down on both of them like a physical weight. It was well past midnight when Evelyn found it, buried in a transaction from nearly a decade earlier, a discrepancy tied not to her father's recent decisions, but to an old business relationship between the Marsh family and the Ashcombe estate, one that had apparently ended badly and had never been fully resolved. "Julian," she said slowly, staring at the page, "did your father once employ mine?" The silence that followed was immediate and total. Julian's expression shuddered closed so quickly it was as though a door had slammed somewhere behind his eyes. "Where did you find that?" he said. It was not a question. "In the archived records. It says your father terminated a partnership with my father's early company 9 years ago, under circumstances that were never explained in the file. That has nothing to do with the current agreement. It might. If there is unresolved history between our families, it could explain some of these discrepancies." "Leave it," Julian said, his voice suddenly cold in a way she had not heard since their first dinner together. "I cannot simply leave it if it is relevant to the deal." "It is not relevant, it is the past. You do not know that unless you tell me what happened." Julian stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and for a moment Evelyn saw something in his expression she had never seen before, not arrogance, not irritation, but something closer to pain, quickly buried beneath anger. "My father destroyed your father's early career," he said, the words clipped and precise, as though he had rehearsed keeping them locked away for years. "He used him, took credit for his work, and discarded him the moment he was no longer useful. It was not the only time he did something like that. It was simply the time that happened to involve your family." Evelyn felt the floor shift beneath her. Why did no one tell me this? "Because your father chose not to speak of it, and I did not think it was my place to reveal it," Julian said. "And because I have spent the last decade trying to build something different from what my father left behind, and I did not particularly want to be reminded, every time I looked at you, of exactly how much damage his name has caused." The words landed like a blow, and Evelyn felt something crack open inside her chest, a mixture of anger and hurt that she could not entirely separate. "You knew this the entire time," she said. "You knew, and you let me sit across from you week after week, learning from you, trusting you, without ever once mentioning that your family destroyed mine. It was not something I could easily explain. You could have tried. And said what? That my father was cruel. That I have spent every day since his death trying to prove that his name does not have to mean what it once meant. That I did not want you to see me the way you clearly see me now, as nothing more than an extension of everything he did." "I do not know how else I am supposed to see this," Evelyn said, her voice rising. "You built your entire company on the ruins of people my father's generation trusted, and instead of acknowledging that, you hid it from me." "I did not build anything on ruins," Julian said, his voice sharp now, cutting through the space between them. "I inherited a broken structure and spent a decade tearing it down and rebuilding it into something that does not repeat his mistakes. If you cannot see the difference between the two, then perhaps you understand me far less than you believe you do. Then explain it to me, properly, not in fragments, not in careful half-sentences designed to protect your own comfort. I do not owe you my entire history simply because you demand it." "No," Evelyn said, her voice trembling now, though whether from anger or something closer to grief, she could not tell. "But you owed my father an apology a decade ago, and instead his daughter had to discover the truth buried in an old file at midnight." The silence that followed felt endless. Julian stood with his back partially turned, his shoulders rigid, His hands braced against the edge of the desk as though he needed the support to remain standing. Evelyn watched him, waiting for something, an explanation, an apology, anything, but he said nothing at all. She left the office without another word, walking out into a hallway lit only by the dim glow of emergency lighting, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not remain in that room a moment longer. It was nearly 1 in the morning when she finally stopped walking, standing near the elevators with no clear plan of where to go next, her chest still tight with everything unsaid between them. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, slow and deliberate, unlike his usual brisk pace. "Evelyn," he said quietly. She did not turn around. "I am not asking you to forgive what my father did," Julian said. "I know that is not mine to ask, but I would like the chance to explain it properly if you are willing to hear it." Evelyn turned to face him, and in the dim light of the empty hallway, he looked different than she had ever seen him, stripped of the composure he wore like armor during the day, something raw and tired visible beneath it. "My father was not simply cruel to your father," Julian said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual sharp precision. "He was cruel to everyone who worked beneath him, myself included. I grew up watching him dismantle people the way other men dismantle furniture, without hesitation, without remorse, and I told myself for years that I would never become him. And then I inherited his company, his title, his name, and I discovered that people expected me to become exactly that, because that was the only version of the Ashcombe family they had ever known. That does not excuse hiding the truth from me." "No," he agreed. "It does not. I was afraid, Evelyn, afraid that if you knew the full history, you would see me as nothing more than his successor, and I did not think I could survive watching you look at me the way I imagine your father looked at him." Evelyn felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, at the raw honesty in his voice, though the hurt had not entirely disappeared. "I need time," she said. "This is not something I can simply set aside because you have finally decided to explain it." "I understand," Julian said. "Take whatever time you need." She left the building that night without looking back, and for the first time since their disastrous first dinner, neither of them knew exactly where things stood between them. The days that followed were quiet in a way that felt heavier than any argument. Evelyn returned to the office out of necessity rather than desire, the agreement between their families still unfinished, still requiring her presence at meetings that had once felt easy and now felt strained with everything neither of them said out loud. Julian was careful with her in those days, careful in a way that felt almost unbearable after weeks of sharp, honest exchange. He no longer teased her about her mistakes. He no longer lingered after meetings ended. He answered her questions directly and professionally, and nothing more, as though he had built a wall between them brick by careful brick, determined not to let her see anything beneath it again. "You do not have to treat me like glass," Evelyn said one afternoon, after he had spent an entire meeting avoiding her eyes. "I am not treating you like glass. You have not argued with me once in 4 days. That is not like you." Julian set down his pen, finally looking at her directly. "I am trying to give you space." "I did not ask for space. I asked for honesty. There is a difference." "I gave you what honesty I had," he said, something tired in his voice. "I am not certain what more you want from me." "I want to understand why you let me find out the way I did," Evelyn said. "Not why your father did what he did. I already understand that. I want to understand why you, specifically, chose silence over telling me yourself." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. "Because I was afraid," he said finally. "Not of you knowing the truth, of watching your opinion of me change the moment you did. I have spent my entire adult life trying to be someone other than my father's son, and some small, foolish part of me hoped that with you, specifically, I might simply exist as myself, without that history following behind me everywhere I went. That was never going to be possible, Evelyn said, gentler now. Not because of who your father was, but because pretending the past does not exist never actually makes it disappear. It only makes it more painful when it surfaces. I am learning that, Julian admitted, slowly. Then let us learn it together instead of separately, Evelyn said. That is all I actually wanted from the beginning. Something in Julian's expression eased, the careful distance he had maintained for days finally softening into something closer to relief. I would like that, he said, though I cannot promise I will always be graceful about it. I have never once expected grace from you, Evelyn said, and for the first time in days he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and the tension that had sat between them for nearly a week finally began, slowly, to dissolve. Evelyn did not return to the Ashcombe office for 4 days. She spent that time at home, helping her father in ways she had never bothered to before, listening more carefully to the stories he rarely told about his early career, the years before the company existed, when he had been a younger man with fewer resources and far too much trust in the people around him. I did not want you to know, her father admitted one evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. It was a painful chapter. I built something from nothing, and a man I respected took what I built and claimed it as his own. I did not want that story following you into every conversation you had with his son. I wish you had told me. Would it have changed anything? Evelyn considered the question honestly. I do not know, she admitted, but I would have understood him differently from the beginning. One evening during those 4 days, her father found her sitting alone on the back porch, staring out at nothing in particular, and settled into the chair beside her without saying anything for a long while. You are quiet, he said eventually. I am thinking. About the Duke or about me? Both, I suppose, Evelyn admitted. I am angry with him for hiding it, but I am also angry that I never knew, that you carried something so painful for so many years and never once mentioned it, even when it might have helped me understand things sooner. Her father was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening yard. There is a particular kind of shame that comes with being wronged, he said finally. People assume that pain like that comes from anger, but it does not entirely. A great deal of it comes from humiliation. I trusted a man who did not deserve it, and I built years of my life around that mistake before I understood what he truly was. It is not an easy thing to admit to your own child. You do not have anything to be ashamed of. He was the one who behaved badly. I know that now, her father said. It took me a long time to believe it, though. For years, I wondered whether I had simply been foolish, whether I had somehow invited what happened by trusting too easily. It is only recently, watching you with his son, watching the way that boy has tried to build something different from what his father left behind, that I have started to let go of some of that old shame. Evelyn reached over and took her father's hand, holding it quietly in the fading light. You were not foolish, she said. You were kind, and someone took advantage of it. Those are not the same thing, no matter how much it might feel that way. Her father studied her carefully, something knowing in his expression. You care about him, he said. It was not a question. Evelyn did not answer immediately, uncertain how to explain the tangle of feelings she had been carrying since that hallway conversation. The anger and hurt sitting uneasily alongside something warmer, something she had been trying not to name. I do not know what I feel, she said finally, but I know it is complicated. Most important things are, her father said. On the 5th day, a message arrived, not from Julian directly, but from his grandmother, Eleanor Ashcombe, requesting that the Marsh family join her for dinner the following weekend. The invitation was brief, almost blunt, entirely unlike the careful formality Evelyn had expected from someone of her status. I would like to meet the family that has caused my grandson so much trouble, the note read. Come Saturday, Bring an appetite." Evelyn's mother nearly fainted at the sight of the Ashcombe crest arriving a second time in their mailbox, though this invitation carried none of the anxious formality of the first dinner. If anything, it felt like a challenge, and Evelyn found herself oddly eager to accept it. In the days leading up to the dinner, Evelyn found herself unexpectedly nervous, more nervous in some ways than she had been walking into the Ashcombe offices for the first time months earlier. She mentioned this to Charlotte, who had become something of a friend over the preceding weeks, during a quiet afternoon at the office while Julian was occupied in a call with a partner named Nathaniel Cole. "You are worried about meeting his grandmother," Charlotte said, not really a question. "I am worried about what she will think of me." "She has already decided what she thinks of you," Charlotte said, smiling. "She has been asking Julian about you for weeks. She even asked me once whether you seemed like the sort of person who would tolerate this family's nonsense or run from it entirely." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that you seem like exactly the sort of person who would stay and argue rather than run." Evelyn considered that, turning it over with a mixture of nerves and something warmer, something like hope. "I suppose that is not entirely inaccurate." "It is precisely accurate," Charlotte said, "which is why I suspect the dinner will go far better than you are currently imagining." A vendor named Grace, who managed several of the smaller accounts under the Ashcombe umbrella, stopped by the desk that same afternoon with a stack of paperwork, pausing when she noticed Evelyn's slightly distracted expression. "You look like a woman preparing for battle," Grace said. "Dinner with a duke's grandmother," Evelyn admitted. "It feels a great deal like preparing for battle." Grace laughed, setting down her papers. "For what it is worth, I have met Alina Ashcombe exactly once at a charity function years ago, and she spent the entire evening telling off a man twice her size for mishandling a donation. If she likes you, you will know within the first 5 minutes. If she does not, you will know even faster." "That is not particularly comforting." "It was not meant to be comforting," Grace said, smiling. "It was meant to be honest. I suspect you will do just fine." The reassurance, small as it was, stayed with Evelyn through the following days, right up until the Saturday when her family finally climbed into the car and made the long drive out toward the countryside where the Ashcombe estate waited, sprawling and grand against the late afternoon light. The Ashcombe estate was exactly as grand as Evelyn had expected, sprawling and elegant, though somehow less intimidating once she was standing inside it, surrounded by a household staff who greeted her family with genuine warmth rather than practiced formality. Alina Ashcombe turned out to be nothing like her grandson's cool composure suggested she might be. She was small, sharp-eyed and disarmingly direct, greeting Evelyn's family with a firm handshake and an immediate assessment that left no room for pretense. "You must be the girl who told my grandson off over dinner silverware," Alina said, studying Evelyn with obvious delight. "I have heard a great deal about you." "I hope not all of it was flattering," Evelyn said. "Very little of it was flattering, actually," Alina said, smiling, "which is precisely why I like you already." Dinner at the Ashcombe estate unfolded in a way Evelyn had not anticipated, less rigid than she had imagined, filled with genuine conversation rather than careful performance. Alina asked pointed questions of Evelyn's father, questions that gently but firmly opened the door to the history both families had avoided for nearly a decade. "My son was not a kind man," Alina said plainly when the subject finally surfaced. "I loved him because he was my child. But I will not pretend he treated people fairly. What he did to your early business, Mr. Marsh, was inexcusable, and I am sorry it took this long for anyone in this family to say so." Evelyn's father, visibly moved, thanked her quietly, and something in the room shifted, an old wound finally acknowledged rather than buried beneath decades of silence. Julian sat across the table throughout most of this exchange, quieter than Evelyn had ever seen him, watching the conversation unfold with an expression somewhere between relief and discomfort. It was only after dessert, when Alina turned her sharp attention directly toward him, that his composure finally cracked. "Tell them what you told me last week," Alina said, an unmistakable glint of mischief in her eyes. "Grandmother," Julian said, a warning in his voice. "Tell them or I will." Julian set down his fork, glanced briefly at Evelyn, and then, with visible reluctance, spoke. "I told her that I have not stopped thinking about that first dinner since it happened," he said. "The argument at your table. I have thought about it nearly every day since." The table went quiet, and Evelyn felt heat rush into her face, uncertain whether to laugh or simply disappear beneath the tablecloth from sheer embarrassment. Her mother's eyebrows rose sharply. Her father looked somewhere between amused and alarmed. "That is not something you needed to announce to my entire family," Evelyn managed. "Apparently my grandmother disagreed," Julian said, though there was something almost boyish in his expression now, stripped of its usual sharp control. "Someone in this family needed to say the honest thing out loud," Alina said primly, reaching for her wine glass with evident satisfaction. "It appears to be a family tradition on both sides now." Laughter rippled around the table, easing the tension that had lingered since the mention of the old business dispute, and Evelyn found herself smiling despite the embarrassment still burning in her cheeks. Beneath the table, unnoticed by anyone else, Julian's hand brushed briefly against hers, a small, uncertain gesture that said more than any of his careful words ever had. Neither of them spoke of it again for the rest of the evening, but something between them had shifted, quietly, permanently, in a way that no argument or old family history could undo. Later that night, as the Marsh family prepared to leave, Julian walked Evelyn to the car alone, the autumn air cool and quiet around them. "I meant what I said," he told her, "about the first dinner." "I gathered that," Evelyn said, "given the entire table now knows about it." "I am not particularly good at saying things gracefully," he admitted. "I am better at contracts than confessions." "You did well enough," Evelyn said softly. Julian studied her for a long moment, something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression that she had never seen from him before, not during their business meetings, not even during their late-night conversations at the office. "I would like to see you again," he said, "outside of contracts and balance sheets." "I think that could be arranged," Evelyn said, smiling despite herself. Before she reached the car, Alina caught up to her, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her age, her sharp eyes fixed on Evelyn with obvious purpose. "A word before you go," Alina said, drawing Evelyn slightly apart from the rest of the departing group. "Of course. My grandson has spent a decade building walls around himself so carefully that most people who meet him never see past the first one," Alina said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier playfulness. "I watched him tonight say something honest in front of an entire table of near strangers, which is a thing I have not seen him do since he was a boy. I do not think you understand what that cost him." "I think I am beginning to," Evelyn said. "Good," Alina said. "Then you will understand why I am asking you, plainly, not to take that honesty lightly. He does not offer it easily, and he does not recover quickly when it is mishandled." "I have no intention of mishandling it." Alina studied her for a long moment, the same sharp assessment she had offered at the start of the evening, and something in her expression softened into something like approval. "No," she said, "I do not believe you do. My son was cruel to your father, Miss Marsh, and I carry that shame with me every day that I have left. But watching my grandson tonight, watching the way he looked at you across that table, I find myself hoping that whatever grows between the two of you might finally undo some small part of the damage he caused." "That is a great deal of weight to place on one dinner," Evelyn said softly. "It is," Alina agreed. "But I am an old woman who has waited a very long time to see my grandson happy. I intend to hope for it as loudly as I please." She squeezed Evelyn's hand once, firm and warm, before turning back toward the house, leaving Evelyn standing near the car with her heart considerably fuller than it had been an hour earlier. She left that night with the strange, unfamiliar feeling of something beginning, something neither of them had planned or expected, born entirely out of an argument that should have ended everything before it started. 6 months passed, and the business agreement that had once threatened to unravel with a single argument had long since been signed, sealed, and quietly forgotten beneath the weight of everything that followed it. Evelyn's father's company had not only survived but grown steadily under the new partnership, freed at last from the shadow of a decade-old wound that had finally been spoken aloud and allowed to heal. Evelyn herself had changed in ways she was still discovering. She read balance sheets now without flinching, negotiated contracts with a confidence she had not possessed a year earlier, and found herself, more often than she would have predicted, standing in the doorway of a certain corner office long after the rest of the staff had gone home, simply because she preferred the company inside it to being anywhere else. The weeks leading up to that Sunday had not been without their own quiet tests. There had been a stretch, early in the spring, when Julian's schedule pulled him away for several weeks to oversee a difficult acquisition on the other side of the country, and Evelyn had spent those weeks discovering what it meant to miss someone in a way that had nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with genuine attachment. They had spoken by telephone most evenings, brief conversations squeezed between his late meetings and her own growing responsibilities at her father's company, where she had, by then, taken on a role far beyond simple liaison. It was during one of those calls, late on a Tuesday night with the line crackling faintly between them, that Julian had admitted something he had never said aloud before. "I do not enjoy being away from you," he said, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of the composure he wore during the day. "I did not expect that. I have spent most of my life perfectly comfortable with distance. It was, in some ways, easier. And now the distance feels like something is missing that I did not know I had grown accustomed to having." Evelyn had smiled at that, alone in her room with the phone pressed close to her ear, feeling something warm settle in her chest despite the miles between them. "You are getting better at this," she said. "At what?" "At saying what you actually feel, instead of hiding behind numbers and contracts." "I have had a very persistent teacher," Julian said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even without seeing it. There had also been harder moments, tests of a different kind. A magazine had run a piece speculating about the Duke's private life, printing half-truths about Evelyn's family that had stung sharply despite being mostly harmless, the kind of casual cruelty that came with a title she had never asked to be associated with. Julian had been furious on her behalf, had spent an entire evening on the phone with lawyers before Evelyn finally convinced him that the best response was simply to ignore it and let the story fade, which it eventually did, though not before her mother had fretted over it for the better part of a week. Through all of it, the small frustrations and the larger fears, something steady had held between them, growing quietly stronger with each difficulty they faced rather than weaker. By the time spring gave way to the warmer months, neither of them spoke of the future in uncertain terms anymore. It had simply become assumed, unspoken but understood, that whatever came next they would face it together. It was against this backdrop, comfortable and hard one, that Julian arrived at the Marsh family home uninvited. A bottle of wine in hand, precisely at the hour Evelyn's mother had mentioned dinner would begin, not a minute early, not a minute late. "You are on time," Evelyn said, opening the door to find him standing on the porch, looking almost nervous in a way she had never witnessed before. "I am learning," he said. "Apparently punctuality matters less than showing up prepared." He held out the wine, and Evelyn recognized the label immediately as one her mother had mentioned in passing weeks earlier, a favorite she rarely allowed herself to buy. You asked someone what wine she liked. I asked Charlotte to make a few discreet inquiries, Julian admitted. I did not want to repeat the disaster of my first visit to this house. You mean the disaster where you insulted our home within 30 seconds of walking through the door? That specific disaster, yes. Evelyn laughed, stepping aside to let him in, and the evening that followed bore almost no resemblance to their first dinner together. Her father greeted Julian at the table with an ease that would have seemed impossible a year earlier, the old wound between their families having settled over time into something closer to mutual respect than lingering resentment. They fell into an easy argument almost immediately, this time about an upcoming election neither of them agreed on, and Evelyn watched with quiet amusement as Julian, who had once refused to concede a single point in any conversation, deliberately let her father win an argument about tax policy that he clearly did not believe. You conceded that on purpose, Evelyn murmured to him, while her father triumphantly refilled his own wine glass, pleased with himself. I did, Julian admitted quietly. It costs me nothing and it makes him happy. I have learned that some arguments are worth losing. That is a remarkable transformation for a man who once told me traffic was not an acceptable excuse for anything. I stand by that position entirely, Julian said, and Evelyn laughed again, the sound warm and easy in the small, crowded kitchen. Her mother, meanwhile, had spent the better part of the meal watching Julian with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman who had once been terrified of him, and was now, evidently, entirely won over. When he complimented the roast, unprompted and meant it, she beamed with the particular pride of a cook who had finally been properly appreciated by the one guest who had once dared to criticize her cooking. You have gotten better at this, her mother told him, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Evelyn had said to him months earlier in his office. I have had a great deal of practice, Julian said, glancing at Evelyn with a small, private smile that suggested he remembered the echo perfectly well. He complimented her mother's cooking without being asked, and meant it, having clearly learned in the months since their first meeting that honesty and kindness were not, in fact, opposing forces. After dinner, when her parents had retired to the living room and the kitchen had emptied of everyone but the two of them, Julian found Evelyn standing near the counter, gathering the last of the dishes, the leftover roast still cooling on its platter beside her. I have been thinking, he said, about that first night. You mentioned that first night a great deal, for someone who spent most of it insulting my family. It was the worst night of my professional life, Julian admitted. I nearly lost an agreement worth a great deal of money because I could not stop arguing with a young woman who refused to be intimidated by my title. And yet here you are. And yet here I am, he agreed, stepping closer, his voice softening in a way that made Evelyn's pulse quicken despite herself. It was also somehow the best night of everything that came after it. I did not expect to find, in the middle of a business dinner I nearly ruined, the person who would change every assumption I had about what I wanted my life to look like. Evelyn set down the dish she was holding, her hands suddenly unsteady, though not from nervousness exactly, something closer to anticipation. You have gotten better at saying things gracefully, she said softly. I have had a great deal of practice, Julian admitted. Mostly because I kept rehearsing this particular conversation in my head, trying to find the right way to say it. And did you find it? I am not certain there is a right way, but I know that I love you, Evelyn. I have known it for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself, and I did not want another dinner to pass without telling you properly, in your family's kitchen, exactly where all of this began. Evelyn felt something warm and overwhelming settle in her chest, all the sharp edges of their first meeting softening into something entirely different, something she had not expected to find in a man who had once criticized her mother's cooking within minutes of walking through the door. I love you too, she said, and the words felt both new and inevitable, as though she had been circling toward them since the moment he first stepped onto her family's porch, 20 minutes early, utterly unaware of how completely that evening would change both of their lives. Julian closed the remaining distance between them, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like the sharp, argumentative energy that had defined their first encounter. It was slow and certain, and entirely without pretense, the leftover roast forgotten on the counter beside them, the sound of her parents' quiet conversation drifting faintly from the next room. When they finally broke apart, Evelyn rested her forehead against his, laughing softly at the sheer improbability of everything that had led them to this moment. "You realize," she said, "that our entire relationship began with you insulting my mother's cooking. I have apologized for that extensively since." "You have, though I still think you meant every word that night." "I did," Julian admitted, a rare, easy smile crossing his face. "But I have since learned that being right about a roast is far less important than being present for the people who made it." Evelyn laughed again, pulling him into another embrace, the kitchen around them warm and familiar in a way it had never been on that first chaotic evening, when a stranger had arrived early and unsettled everything she thought she understood about her own life. Outside, the autumn evening had settled into full darkness, and inside the small, imperfect house that Julian had once dismissed as too small, the two of them stood together in the quiet aftermath of an argument that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the beginning of everything that mattered most. Some arguments, Evelyn had come to understand, were not endings at all. They were simply the loudest, messiest way two people learned to recognize each other, long before either of them was ready to admit it. And as she stood there, wrapped in the arms of the same insufferable, arrogant man who had once refused to apologize for arriving 20 minutes early, Evelyn found herself grateful, more grateful than she had ever expected to be, for a broken plate, an overcooked roast, and the argument that had somehow, impossibly, become a love story.